one hard part about security is that it's a about security in controlling access is that it's a negative goal. So who can tell me what a negative goal means?
Trying to prevent something.
What you can do, what you cannot do.
Yeah, I mean it's this weird thing where you can't prove. I mean, it's easy if it's a positive goal, then you can do it. You can have some results that say yes, this occurred, and then you can say yes, it's a positive goal. But to prove that someone didn't access something without authorization, how do you prove that? Well, it's. I mean, what's that?
Flag the file.
No, but how do you prove it in general? Like, can you be absolutely sure that 100%? Can you give a proof that something wasn't accessed in some way? It's like, I mean, yes. So this is in experimental sciences, it's called a negative result, which in this case it's a negative goal, and you can prove that someone did access it if you have some kind of log file or something that tells you that someone and violated security, but you can't ever prove that someone didn't. Right? The only way, I mean, it's you can a million years from now you might find out that the one secret that you thought you had, was known by a group of people that you never knew. So there's lots of examples of security techniques, and I think you've seen some of these. One is tickets in general. So there's and it follows very much the ticket model, where if you want to control access to something like a concert, you give someone a ticket and they come in. Did you guys do anything with Kerberos, the MIT? Okay, in the Kerberos system, which is an authentication system that was developed mostly at MIT, you have the notion of a ticket, which is a bit string that has certain fields and is encrypted a certain way that you give to someone, to a computer. When that computer has that ticket, it can then access a set of resources. One of the trade-offs with tickets is that once you give one of these out, it's hard to take it back. So, I mean, it's different than the next one, which is an access control list. Access control list says, for every resource, I have a list of who can do what. Who's authorized to do what, when, where, why, how. And unlike tickets, it's very easy to deauthorize someone or some action by going to that one access control list, which you control, and changing that. Encryption, I heard you guys did RSA in your discrete. Is that, some people remember it, some people don't? Okay.
We did, but look, no.
All right.
We didn't program for it.
Okay. All right, but you get the main ideas of encryption. Yes.
Why can't you just put some sort of expiration date on a ticket?
You can do that, and Kerberos has some notion of an expiration date. But if you want to cancel something sooner than that, you can and you don't want to make it too short, because then everyone's always grabbing tickets. So that's a trade-off. So PGP, how many of you guys have heard of PGP? Pretty good. Do you guys all have a PGP key? No? Okay. PGP, pretty good privacy. It's a program that was developed to use a public key infrastructure. It's open source, and there was actually this huge fight between the author of PGP and the RSA folks over patent infringements, and is this big mess. But in the end, right now, MIT actually makes PGP available to anybody, and you can go to web.mit.edu and dig in there, and you can get this PGP program and get yourselves keys, and it's free, and it helps you. It's integrated with Eudora, I think. If you guys don't have a PGP key, I highly recommend that you get one. EM shielding. Have you guys heard about EM shielding before? Electromagnetic shielding. What's the problem?
That's from freaking.
Pardon?
It's from freaking.
Freaking?
PHR.
Oh, PHR, freaking. Well, what happens in EM, like this monitor right here, it's giving off EM radiation. And you can build something that sits over here and can probably get a pretty good idea of what's on that screen, just from, if you know the technical readouts. Is that what you mean by freaking?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a story that a professor at MIT tells. What's that? Oh. There's a story that a professor at MIT tells about how he was doing this project when he was helping to develop a fax machine. and this was for the Army, and they wanted to be able to transmit, maps and instructions. And they unlike other folks that did a great job, and they were able to fax these things over. And at some point, the general who was in charge of this says, "This is great and everything, but I want to show you something." And he takes him over to the room next door and says, "Okay, so in one room they had this faxing set up with the machines going back and forth." Takes him over to the room or a truck or something next door, and he says, "Look at this." And some guy, he had these technical guys there, and they had an exact copy of the thing that had been transmitted on this machine. So things like keyboard clicks, EM radiation from the screen, all this kind of thing is information that people can use to figure out to violate your security. Padlocks. It can be very effective at some points. If you're a good key pick, it probably is a lot less effective. But nevertheless, it's something that people use. For example, a friend of mine who was working in one of these high security government labs, one of their protocols was that whenever they came into a room with a secure computer, this computer, by the way, couldn't be connected to any kind of network. Whenever they walked in, this was done for some kind of nuclear simulations. They had a padlock on the outlet. So you actually had to get a key to this padlock, open it up, and then plug the computer in, and on your way out you had to lock it back up and take the key back. So it's what does this prevent? What level? What does this prevent? Well, it's one more thing that you have to do in order to be able to access that data.
Just bring in a battery.
Yeah, you could bring in a battery, but it might, unless batteries get a lot smaller, it might become a little bit more obvious. But you're right. There's always a way around security. Independent certification. So you guys have heard about these hackers who are hired, ex-hackers, maybe went to jail, come out, they make they make a lot of money now because people will hire them to try to break into systems. And it's ironically, I mean, there's all these stories you hear about it being quite lucrative for some folks.
That's upstairs.
Oh, really?
That's state security.
Oh, yeah. This is the John Rando company, right? Yeah. Rando actually was the head of services for was digital, and now is Compaq. And then when he left that, I heard he came to do the security thing. I forgot he was upstairs. And then obscurity, we talked about that one. So security is very difficult. Well, let's give you an example of how unintuitive it can be to make a secure system. Suppose that you're on a computer and that every email message that was coming out of your computer was intercepted by a human and read by a human. So if you're in some company or some government lab and they're watching every piece of email, they read all the headers, everything. But you had this 1 gigabyte file you want to get out of there, and you decided, oh, well, here's a channel. There's an email channel. It's the only one I have. I'm going to use this one to get this file out. How can you do that?
If you send enough email messages and whoever you're sending to knows that the 340th character is going to be a character from this file. Yeah.
Good. So that's the idea of metadata. Imagine that you did something like that. So that's one, is like, say every nth character is going to be something that you put that corresponds to some part of this file that I'm sending out. Another example might be by the length of the words. You might say the length of the words of each word corresponds to a number, right? Well, here's another piece of data that doesn't have any human, any English semantic meaning, but the word has now is the number 3, right? Or you could do things like, say you're going to take the whole message, and then you're going to count the number of letters of each type, right? A's, B's, C's, question marks, and so on, and then use a way to convert that graph that you get out into some piece of information. So there's lots of different ways that you can send it out via metadata that way. And how are you going to decipher what they're using if they're sending this file out? It's probably not. Again, negative result. When someone sends this email out, you can read it, you can run all sorts of analysis on it. This thing doesn't like me today. He could run all sorts of analysis, but guess what? It's a negative result, so you're not going to be able to prove very easily that the information didn't get out, which is why when you want to really secure a computer, you just cut it off from the network, because as long as there's a channel going out, like the network, that's high speed, it becomes difficult to secure it. Now, one thing that you'll notice about this approach is it's effective, but it's much slower. So that's why anything that's a high-speed medium is actually more of a threat than a very low bandwidth medium. So low bandwidth medium might be you walking in, and reading part of this gigabyte file and memorizing it, and then walking out and telling someone else about it. That's effective, but it's very low bandwidth. And the point there is that data has some time value. Or secrets can have some time value. So if you know for some secret, like whether Alan Greenspan's going to raise or lower the rates, imagine that he sent out a message and encrypted that a day before. Well, if you used all the computational power you had available, you might decrypt it a few days later, but a few days later the data is useless. That secret is useless. So the whole point of being able to secure something is to make it to be the case that the amount of energy required to break the security, the amount of effort required to break it, is going to either be so much that it outweighs the amount of benefit you get back from knowing the data, or that it's going to take so much effort that you're going to that the secret having access to this resource once you get it is going to be something that's useless. So that's a different standard. You don't necessarily want to be 100% secure. And that because of that, it makes things like these, like RSA, something feasible, right? If you use 40-bit RSA and the time value of the data is, a few seconds or minutes, even though you can break, say, 40-bit type of encryption, who cares? That's enough. So there are also some design principles when you're thinking about security, and it's even more important that you keep that as you're designing a security into a system that you keep these in mind. First one is keep it small and simple. Okay, why do you want to keep something small when you're building it, like your security system? Why do you want to make it sort of not this huge thing? What happens if you make things bigger? Well, there's more access points, there's more complexity, it becomes harder, more difficult to understand, to look at it and be able to understand it, which means that there's more of a chance that someone else is going to be able to find some way into it. When you think about your defaults, make them fail-safe. So for example, it's better to say, I have a list and I'm only going to, people on this list have permission to access this resource, as opposed to saying, here's a list of people who don't have access to it. Right? Because if you forget to put someone on that list, in the first case, they won't have permission to, and they'll holler and scream, and at some point they'll get it if they're authorized. If it's the other one where you're excluding a list of people who don't have permission, if you forget to put someone on that, then they will have permission and they can go in and do whatever they want. The third one is think about a more complete, systematic, and holistic approach. And this is hackers love getting. This is the one that hackers love to get around, because people sometimes don't think out of the box, and hackers love thinking out of the box. Favorite example is when you're trying to break into a website. One of the things that hackers do is they automatically assume that the front door is going to be pretty well protected. So trying to get through the firewall, through that. I mean, that's the part that's where all the big all that good stuff is. So they're like, oh, well, how do I find a backdoor into it? Well, these IT folks who might have designed this firewall might not have thought of things holistically. They might be thinking, if I protect this one access point to the internet and protect it as best I can, then I'm safe. But guess what? In larger organizations, one thing that people like to do these days, it's more frequent in larger organizations, and because of the size of the organization, is they say, oh, I want to actually go home and work on my files at home. And I want to be able to access my computer from home. Oh, and Windows lets me do this. If only it wasn't for that damn firewall that doesn't let me through. And then they're walking by CompUSA one day and they find a cheap $50 modem and the light turns on. They go back to their office, plug the modem in, push a few buttons on Windows. They go home, and now they can dial in. Okay, now guess what? That dial-in point is a huge, I mean, these people aren't necessarily security experts, so maybe they didn't even put any passwords on this thing. So what these hackers will do is they'll get a list of numbers that go into the company, and they'll start calling them. And they'll have a computer that does this. And it'll do it at random, you know, so that you don't hear like phone number 1 ringing, phone number 2, and so on, right? There have been people caught doing that. They'll do it at random, and guess what? They'll find a list of 3 or 4 modems, and you know, say there's 1,000 people in some organization, 3 or 4 modems, and one of them will likely have no password, or the password will be password or something silly. And now they have access, you know, now they're in. Okay, and so the IT folks, you know, they weren't thinking holistically about the system. They weren't thinking that the network extends throughout the whole company, and it can be connected from any place in the company outside. One thing about Ars Digita, which is funny, is that you guys, they have one of these 802.11b networks, so these wireless, you know, you can put a card and so the funny thing is that Carberries, signal actually reaches out to Carberries. So what does that mean? Well, it's great if you're from Ars Digita, you can take your laptop and go and work out there. But now actually, there's been people spotted who have nothing to do with Ars Digita, but are over there sipping their coffee and surfing through the Ars Digita. And guess what? Any open shares on Windows machines at Ars Digita? Guess who can access them now? The next one is least authority, which is that when you give someone authority to do something, try to give them the least amount of authority they need to get their job done, or the entity that least amount of authority it needs to access the shared resources it needs to. And this is kind of like this need-to-know system in government. It's about least authority. You only know, even though you're at the same level as somebody else, a top secret or a higher clearance, you only are supposed to know what you need to know. The next one is human acceptability. Imagine if someone said, "Here's a great way to make sure no one's going to no one's going to steal your ATM card. What we're going to do is we're going to make you, when you walk up to the ATM, you have to put your fingerprint in, you have to do a retinal scan, and then you get a prick on your finger and get a DNA test. That'll make sure, you know, I mean, it's great. It's probably less likely that, you know, someone's going to be able to steal your ATM card and fake all 3 of those. But guess what? It's completely unacceptable. Similarly, you can imagine there's people who are really into security, who want to make access to certain files very difficult, even though they're important. But the problem with putting too much security in is if you make the system less useful as a whole, then security starts getting in the way of getting useful work done, which is a big concern for for when you're implementing something across a larger system, because then changing the thing and taking it back might be quite difficult. And the last thing is immediate feedback. Whenever you find a security fault, you should go back and immediately try to feed what you've learned back into revising the security. A lot of folks, you know, they'll set up the security system and, oh, someone broke in, and okay, great, we'll just patch that up and we're done. That's usually a mistake, because when there's been a break-in, guess what? There might have been other things that have been propagated, and there might be a lot of other holes. Use that learning and feed it back. When you read about security and look at security papers, think about these design principles, because the other value that they have, in addition to being design principles, is there are ways that hackers, or if you're trying to break the system, there are ways that you can, approaches or frameworks that you can use to try to figure out security issues. So let's take a simple example of security, which is virtual memory. So remember, we talked about one of the things about aspects of virtual memory is you wanted protection. So you wanted protection you wanted one process to be able to be, its memory space to be protected from another process's memory space. So how do you do that? Well, there's several different levels. One is that you have distinct pages for the data of different processes. So 2 processes don't share the same page when they're writing data. Well, how do you protect these different pages? Well, each page is part of a distinct memory space. So one process's pages are in one memory space, another ones are in another. Great, but how do you protect that? Oh, and the way that you protect that, that you gate that, is in the hardware you'll have an address register that has the page that uses that you use when you're accessing the page maps, and that's how whenever you change that, you change to you do it on a per process basis. You change to another address space. So this register, which is in hardware, makes sure that each process can only access its own page map and therefore its own pages. Well, great. So there's this hardware register well, how do you guard that? Well, the way you guard that is you have something in hardware which is called the user or the kernel bit. And this is something that if that bit is set into kernel mode, then you're authorized to change that page address register. And if it's set in user mode, then you're not authorized to change it. And how do you protect that? Well, you protect that by saying anything that's in kernel mode can only change that to user mode. Anything that's in user mode can only change that to kernel mode. And so that way a user can't, when that gets switched over to kernel mode, the processor knows that it needs to run the kernel program that was initially identified to it when the operating system booted up. So you can keep going on this level. Who's going to protect the computer? Who's going to protect the building that the computer is in, and so on. And you'll find these chains that go through. But they all start from trying to secure one shared resource like this. There's no guarantees that you can actually protect information. And in fact, in some cases, protecting information is actually impractical. So one case of that is medical records. Do you really want your medical records, encrypted and sealed and put in some vault somewhere? Yes? Excellent. So what's that?
He's an attorney.
Oh, he's an attorney. Well, actually, that's not going to get you a lot of money if you're an attorney. You want it to be unprotected, right? So you can have lawsuits. So how do you if you? I mean, what's the problem? What's the obvious problem if it's in a vault somewhere and encrypted and?
It's an emergency, you can't get them quickly.
Exactly, it's an emergency. You can't get them quickly enough. So actually, I'm wrong. That creates lawsuits, right? So you actually want them quite readily available. But on the other hand, you don't want just anybody being able to see them, right? You don't want, if your neighbor's a doctor, you don't want them being able to look at your files. So how can you provide some measure of security there? Well, one interesting way to do it is to log access to that shared resource, in this case the medical records. So what you do is you authenticate someone before they access it, and then you log who, what, when, where, why about that access. So what that means is that now, imagine you're the owner of that medical record. There's a log that's associated with those medical records. Now what you can do is go back and see who looked at them. So if someone looked at them that you don't think was authorized, then you can use something like the law, the police, the feds, whatever, to go and try to resolve that situation. So the threat of that punishment then is going to become your de facto security. So this is one way to do that. It's the same thing for IRS agents, right? IRS agents. This was a big issue. You probably heard a while ago that there was all sorts of instances where they were actually able to find that an IRS agent was looking at records that they shouldn't have been looking at. In particular, typically it's your neighbors and friends. You want to know. Yes.
I read a news article really recently about how the FBI is having a problem like this where they didn't have one before computers because they had a librarian who would manage control and would sort of know who was supposed to be looking at what. But now that everything has been computerized, there's no system in place to govern who ought to have access to what, or or particularly to watch for people who are looking at things that they maybe oughtn't to be.
Yeah, and that's actually from a government and also from just any institution that's been around for a while. This is exactly why this is becoming more of an issue, because there information access used to be more controlled when it was paper-based. And as it's becoming more electronic, it's the same systems that worked for the paper-based don't tend to offer the same kind of security that the same type of security in the electronic world. There's a professor who a few years ago, Peter Solovitz at MIT, he was working with the Mayo Clinic. And one of the security problems they had there was, their system actually is quite amazing. Apparently they have these tubes that go all around this Mayo Clinic, and someone puts some medical files here in some tube, and it's actually paper, and then this tube, it's a little container, and it whisks it off somewhere else, and they what's that?
It's like a drive in the bank.
Yeah, it's like, it is, and he says it's actually quite amazing. But even then, he said, because of this system, even though it's paper-based, you have these things whizzing all over the place, and anyone can request one of these because you never know who their next doctor might be to see you, and they might need it. So the issue, because of the fact that these things whizzed around and there was no librarian, then you had this security issue come up again. And so he was helping them develop some system like this where you would have to log, if you were looking at someone's records, you would need to have some log of the fact that you did, so that later on the patient could search and make sure that nothing was that their rights hadn't actually been violated. A very simple example of this. Suppose that you have a room and you're sharing a 3-bedroom with someone, and suppose that you're all three of you are working at different startups, and actually they end up being competing startups, and so you have all this proprietary stuff in your room, and you don't want your roommates to come in. Now one of your roommates all of a sudden has a really bright idea and says, "Hey, the fire escape is out of your bedroom, isn't it? Well, I guess that means that you should make it easy for us to be able to get into your bedroom in case there's a fire." Right? So what do you do using this type of security to make sure that they don't just happen to come in, and check it out? Well, one thing you could do is you could put some kind of fancy alarm on your door to detect, when they come in. But, maybe you don't want that, because if there's a fire and they come in and something goes off, and, it can be an issue. But what's a very simple, the simplest low-cost way that you can do this?
Break the fire alarm?
Break the fire alarm? Well, and still keep, what's that?
I said, let them burn to death. If you break
Let
the fire.
yeah. Switch rooms, yeah.
Keep your stuff alert.
It's- Yeah. Well, imagine you did the following, which was, imagine that you had a key, and you said, here's the key to my room. I'm going to make it available, and I'm going to put it in a well-known place, so anybody who needs to get in there, if you smell smoke, you can get out. What you do is you take that key and you seal it in some kind of envelope, staples and stuff like that. So now, the thing is, it's not that they can't get into your room, but it's that if they do, they're going to have to rip open this big envelope, which is now big and prominent, so anyone can find it, right? And grab the key, and so you'll be able to ask them, why did you come into the room? It doesn't prevent them from breaking the security, but it allows you to know when they did.
The problem I see with this system is destruction is very reactive. In other words, you're not preventing the thing from happening in the first place, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem if you could be sure of the identity of a person, but then there's always just using a misnomer.
Well, this approach here is reactive in the sense that the reason you need to use this sometimes is because this approach is because it's too impractical to try to, it's too impractical, like in the medical records. You don't want to secure the medical records so much that they aren't instantly accessible when there's an emergency and a doctor needs to see them. Right. Your recourse in that case is to be able to make sure no one sees them by putting some huge penalty for if they get caught.
The authentication is a really important part of that.
That's right.
Missing from that envelope example.
That's right.
If, like you said, if you could use a fake name, then it's totally
Yeah.
worthless security, right? But if you're guaranteed, however, that the person.
Right, and like in the medical record place, it might be too cumbersome to authenticate yourself as a doctor, right? But if you could pre-authenticate yourself, pre-authenticate the hospital, then at the very least there's an entity there who's very well incented not to violate the security protocols, because if they do, you can sue them. So the whole point is to make sure that you set up the system so that there are these checks and balances to disincent the security from being violated without authorization.
The recent
Yes.
fire alarm case,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know which roommate stole.
But
Unless,
there's no authentication.
unless you have two keys, one in two of each of two boxes or n boxes, and you give each of the different boxes, and you give each of them.
There's a fire.
I'm sorry. That's too bad.
And Luis, as soon as they steal the key, they make a copy. You replace your lock and it costs
Yeah.
$35. Then they do it again.
Right.
And again.
Right. So there's no, so there are no, you know, what I mean, everything costs, you know, there's nothing that's foolproof, right? There's always some way to get around it. Nanny cams is one way. You put some kind of secret camera somewhere, and you give them this key thing, and then they think they can get away with it, and then right? I mean, so secure. Yeah, that's right. You guys talked about cryptography, which is a way when you actually do want to prevent someone from getting your data. There's a notion of cryptography to convert your data, which is known as the original data, which is known as plain text, into something that's encrypted, which is ciphertext. Now, did you guys talk about how different attack modes to try to bypass encryption? Okay, so I'll go through. There's if you think about how you might actually try to break someone's encryption, there's 6 main categories of attack. One of them is called ciphertext only, which means that you have access to the ciphertext, but you don't know what plain text, for example, created that ciphertext. So you just see stuff, encrypted data coming out of some pipe, or you get some page with something that's encrypted. The next one is known as known plain text. And what that means is that in addition to having the ciphertext, you actually know what the plain text was that created that ciphertext. So now you just have to find out what happened in the middle, how one got converted into the other. Do you have a question?
Just didn't understand. You have the original source?
Yeah, you have the original plain text.
So your goal isn't to get the plain text.
Why do you
have to attack this one?
Oh, sorry. The reason is because there's other data that you want to decrypt. So imagine that you have one set of let's say you had your name encrypted, and so you say, based on the fact that I have my name encrypted, I'm going to try to find out in future ciphertext what the plain text was that corresponded to it. The next level up is chosen ciphertext. So that's where you can choose what the ciphertext, what the plain text is that's being converted into ciphertext. And then there's adaptive chosen plain text, which is it's a subset of the chosen plain text, in which you can actually it's a little bit of a feedback loop. So suppose that you were able to feed in a piece of plain text and get back a piece of ciphertext, and based on what you learned there, you put in another piece of plain text and got back another piece of ciphertext, and based on what you learned there, and you kept doing this. There is the other side of that, which is chosen ciphertext. So imagine if you could say, I'm choosing this ciphertext, now you tell me what the plain text is associated with it.
Now
that one seems a little bit.
So if that were adaptive, you'd be done.
Yeah, and so if it's adaptive, if you had adaptive ciphertext, then you can basically give any piece of ciphertext over. The thing there that you might want to do if you have an adaptive ciphertext is actually try to find, if you can find the key, right, then you can use it to start break another level deeper into the encryption system. For RSA, what type of attack do you think you could try out? Or step back. For the public key encryption system, what type of attack? If you have my public key, what can you do? Pardon?
Try and factor it.
You can try and factor it, but if you try, which of these attacks could you do? Because suppose you want to find if there's any weaknesses in the key. It's not adaptive plain text, because you can choose any plain text you want and then convert it into ciphertext, and then based on what you learn there, you can keep doing that. Have you guys gotten over this, the whole public and private key encryption? No, yes, no.
We've done that like 100 times.
Yeah, but never paid.
We've never really understood it, though.
Message from Mars. Well, let's okay. Why don't I cover this? Why don't I go a little bit quickly through this, and then there's certain key things that you should know, which is that the third bullet here, which is that a message, that if you encrypt a key with a secret key, if you encrypt a message with a secret key, you can decrypt it with the public key. And if you encrypt a message with a public key, you can decrypt it with the secret key. Okay, so that's what's the thing that's really interesting about this, is that you can use that fact to do two things with once you know someone's public key. You can secure communications, and you can use it for some form of authorization. So why doesn't someone tell me how you can use it to secure communication if I have your public key? Yes.
If you want to send me a message, you can encrypt it and send it to me?
Right. That's right. So if I have your public key, which is should be available to anyone, I can just encrypt the message using your public key, and then you, who know your secret key, gets that message and then decrypts it. Okay. Pardon? Well, email systems can
Your public key is your address.
Your actually your public key is your is something that you can. It's a string of bits that you can get that's accessible to anybody. So hopefully that can send you email if they want to send it to you encrypted with it. But your secret key is something that you have inside. Oh, are you making an analogy to?
Yeah, like a username and a password.
Oh, but the second thing is the thing that you can't do with email, which is imagine that imagine that I got a message, and I wanted to know that it was from you, right? Like if you're sending me a message, and you're saying, and you want the person to know that it came from you, what you would do is you would send me that message encrypted with your secret key. And then when I get it, then what I'll do is I'll take it and I'll say, well, I'm going to apply your public key, which I know, and if I get back, if I get back something that I'm expecting from you, then I know that this was, or if I can decrypt this into something intelligible even, there's a good chance that it was from you. Right? Now that assumes that your secret key has not been compromised, because once your secret key is compromised, all bets are off. But notice that there's this interesting symmetry in the sense that if you do it one way, you do encrypted communication. If you do this a different way, you can get some kind of authentication. Yes.
So you make sure in the second case that no one has changed the message in the way, a small change. I mean, you have encrypted someone in the middle of the way, said, oh, just make a couple of changes here.
Right.
You go to the end, kind of makes
Okay.
sense. It's not the same thing he said, but it's kind of makes
Okay.
sense. How do you make
Well,
sure?
what you can do is when I initially contact you, I can send you the first message that I send you can be what's called a nonce. And you'll see this later on in the notes. So I can send you a random number that I pick. And I can send that over to you. Now if you actually have the secret key, then you can figure out what that nonce is. And then what you then send me back is that nonce with something else in there, like hello or encrypted. And when I get that back, I need to find that nonce in there. Now, if I make any change here, a good cipher will have this turn into complete random, just completely unintelligible random stuff. So but you're getting to where we're going, which is you need to be able to. There's lots of good ways to use this type of back and forth and layer stuff on top, depending on what you put in here, to get authentication. Let's talk about server-mediated authentication. Now remember, it used to be the case that you didn't have this nice symmetry of public and private keys being able to be used to encrypt and decrypt in this way. Before, when you would communicate, you'd have to have some kind of shared secret, right? So you'd have like the passcode or something, and it was this one shared secret that you would have to communicate to somebody else. Now the problem with that, and the reason that Reves and company, the reason that they were so successful with this is that this doesn't require you to have a shared secret in a sense, because the public key is something that's widely available. So what you needed in order to communicate securely was server-mediated authentication, and you can also use a public or private key system now with this. And it makes it stronger, but there still can be a need for it. So what happens in server-mediated authentication? Well, you have a trusted server, and you have two users who want to communicate securely. So what you do is A will go to the trusted server and say, I want to communicate to B. And so what does B return? So B will return the session key, which is some kind of, it can either be a shared secret or it can be some kind of special key just for that communication that's going to happen. And that's encrypt, and the key for A, put B up here, and it's going to seal that with B's key, and then it's going to send that along with the session key sealed with A's key. So this is the message that gets sent back to A. So what is A going to do with it? Well, A is going to pull out the session key. So now it has a key to communicate with B with. That's a one-time key that's going to be used for this session, so it gets thrown away afterwards. It helps you secure the communication better. And then this here is something that it's going to send to B. So what happens when B gets this? Well, when B gets this, it's going to say, oh, this thing is something that I have a session key that I can use to communicate with A. And there'll be routing information so that you can go back and forth. So now B is going to get this information. Now they both have a session key, and they can both start, that was sent securely, and now they can both start communicating.
Does B get a session key from A or from the server?
It gets it from A. So this part here is what gets sent from A to B.
What does the subscript represent?
That means it's B's key, and it's been sealed with B's. When I put these brackets around it, means this is a message, and this is the key that it was sealed with, and that's B's key.
That's still B's public key? Or?
In a public-private key encryption system, this would be, the server would seal this with B's public key. If you're using shared secrets, then what happens is that the trusted server needs to know the keys, the actual A's and B's and everybody's keys, that it's.
If they got hacked, then everyone's security would be compromised.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, even now, what's one of the ways that you could, if you hacked into TS, suppose you had a public-private key infrastructure, so the trusted server doesn't even know what the secret keys are. What's one way that you could try to compromise the communication between A and B?
Just monitor the session keys.
Yeah.
Masquerade as B and provide some other key to A and pretend to be B, and then.
Yeah, but assume that this guy is able to get the. I mean, if you were here and you had to be able to send a message with B's encrypted, with B's public key, right, as A, then B would know that. I mean, if you change this key, then.
Well, I mean, but you would also pose as B on the network somewhere.
Oh, so you're saying compromise both of the, like this, and then have some kind of man-in-the-middle attack, as it's called. Yeah, you could do something like that. But if you were suppose that you just had access to TS, what could you do? And you wanted someone, yeah.
You could do a really, really short message, and with that short message, server A, it might actually come out like hi or something. It might actually come out to be a word, so A will be like, all right, I'll respond. And you get A's key.
Well, what you can do is, I mean, you're getting at something which is trying to attack a piece of this, which is the session key. Like, imagine if you picked a short session key, or imagine if you picked a session key so that it was cryptographically weak, right? And you started issuing these. Would A and B, would they really know this? Maybe not, right? And maybe someone else could sit on that and listen to this and listen to this conversation and start trying to break that key without TS even giving that
If you're
key
hacking
to
into
somebody
TS,
else.
Wouldn't it just be simpler just to know what the session keys that they're sending out are?
Yeah, but that
Easy and weak than having to hack.
right. If you hacked into TS and you were handing out and you were sending out session keys, then it might look a little bit suspicious depending on how many you were sending out. So if you wanted to protect yourself more as the hacker, right, and make it more difficult for someone to know that this has been hacked, the trade-off here in this case, if you fix the session keys, is that you still have to do some work if you can sniff these packets, but it's a lot harder for someone to know that TS is doing anything really bad, right? So this is another one of these, the negative results, right? If TS, I mean, there's a lot of these, I mean, some of these viruses that you get, one of the ways you catch them is you start looking at your modem and it's like sending all this stuff. And you're like, what the heck, you know, what's going on here? And so it's yet another way, and if you're a security expert, one of the things you look at is sort of spurious traffic coming out or traffic that you don't expect. And if you want to get around, if you don't want to get caught that way, then one way is just to say, let's make the keys themselves weak. Okay, any questions on that?
How do you sniff packets?
It depends on the. Let's see. It depends on the mechanism. If you're, for example, if it's a wireless network, then you can have put an antenna out and see what's. Oh, sorry. Neil. Okay. You can put an antenna out and see and hear the EM that's coming through. If it's a wired network, you can actually put there's some gadgets that you can actually put across the wire to read what's going through. If you go talk to any of these network admins, they have these great things, which is they'll put this little gadget on and they'll be able to tell something about that traffic. You could do that. You could if you have access to some of the the tunnels that are used to house fiber. Fiber will be a lot harder, but to have any of the coax cable, for example, that's connected to your cable modem eventually, you could sniff packets that way. So anytime there's a shared link that makes it, that exposes or a link that isn't secure, which would be a long haul link, those are two easy ways to try to get in. Okay, yeah, a question? Okay. All right.
With a long haul link, you're going to have so much traffic going on it that it would just get lost in the jumble, wouldn't it?
Well, that's why it's funny. You have something like Carnivore. I mean, what you do is you put, when you sniff these packets, because they're running on standard or well-known protocols, you can decipher each one. And you can know where it's going, right? And you can look. And so unless you have some custom protocol that you've developed, it's pretty easy for these things to try to figure out, to match, amongst the fixed set of protocols that it's looking at, what kind of packet is this? Right. But then you get hosed with all the other network problems, which is, imagine if there's congestion in that line and you start sending some other datagrams on some other link, right? It's not necessarily the case that you'll be able to sniff all the packets for a given message. And there's a standard called X509, which is used by SSL, which we'll discuss shortly, which is SSL is a secure sockets layer that browsers like Netscape, Internet Explorer, all the modern browsers use. And a certificate is somewhat like a table, like we were talking yesterday, where it's issued by a well-known certificate authority like Verisign. You can actually go to Verisign and apply for a personal certificate. And at least a while ago, they used to give them to you for free for personal use. But they would go through this huge mechanism to authenticate you. So you had to, I don't know what you had to give them, your social security and copy of all sorts of information before they would issue you this certificate. So what does a certificate typically contain? Well, a certificate has the issuer's name or some kind of identifying material. It has a signature. And then it also has the issuee's name and their key, and some valid dates, and some admin information.
signature mean here?
We're going to get to that. So what happens is when you go to someone like Amazon, or you're trying to do e-commerce over SSL, you'll get something like this back. And this will be Amazon, this will be their key, this will be Verisign and their signature. And so now you as the client, you have to figure out, well, what am I going to do with this certificate to make sure that I'm actually talking to the right Amazon.com machine. So the first thing you do is you say, it's basically a two-step process. One is to validate the certificate. And once you've used that, then you can start communicating with the key. So establish So how do you validate this certificate? Well, just give you an example. Imagine that you have the, well, one thing you have to assume first is that you have the public key of something like Verisign, of the issuer. And that has to be something that you trust as an assumption, is that you have the right public key. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can make sure that's the case. So assuming that you have that, imagine that you sent to Verisign that signature, one of these things, and your key, and then you seal that with the key of the issuer. And this again, this is the key, the public key that we assume that you have. So suppose you send that off to Verisign. Well, what you assume is that Verisign will be able to decrypt this. And what they'll do with this signature is something they've previously encrypted with their secret key. So this is K issuer secret. This is K issuer public. And what it contains is something that corresponds to this particular certificate. So it'll have something like the issuer's name, or issuee's name, the valid dates. Yes?
I'm sorry, just to be a context, this is something a user would do when they get on Amazon to make sure they're talking with them?
This is something the user's client does for them. So Netscape, when you click onto when you go onto HTTPS, it's a protocol that uses secure socket layer, and so it does this for you.
Okay.
So issue's name, the valid dates, say the key of the issuee, their public key, of course, and then what's that question?
On here it says to verify need to securely obtain secured authorities. Certificate authorities public key.
Right.
Now that wouldn't be Verisign. It sounds like it would be Verisign.
No, that would be Verisign.
Well, that conflicts with what we heard in a guest lecture a week or two ago, which basically he said that Netscape contains the certificate authorities public key.
Right. Well, that's right. But that's right. That's what I was going to get to, which is that the way that you're sure that it's the right public key is that it usually comes built into the program.
Okay.
Okay. And the program like Netscape or Internet Explorer will have these keys built in, because if you actually go and try to get them, like if you try to get them through the network, right? But if you try to, if they're already embedded, then that's okay. But the point is that there has to be something that you trust. Right, and you have to trust that the Netscape program you got actually has their public key. Because I could give you a Netscape program that has, my public key, and then when you go off to, and I could, if I'm the man in the middle, I do a man in the middle attack, then even though it's embedded, you'll still be in trouble. So but that's in general, you have to that's the way that you secure it. And if you're really paranoid.
Would someone actually do this lookup that you're describing here?
So in the case that you would do this lookup is if you go and this certificate authority is one that isn't recognized by default in your. So there can be, Verisign isn't the only one that's out there. There can be others. And so what'll happen is, I don't know if you've ever clicked on one of these things, and you get this thing saying certificate. You have to accept the certificate. Well, that's what you're doing, is you're verifying that you're actually looking at a certificate and you're trying to verify that this is that you actually believe this is for real. And it'll give you some information about the certificate, like it'll tell you this type of thing here. And if you don't believe it, you can actually call the people up as one way to see if it's for real. People tend not to do that. They just click yes, yes, yes and go through. But that's what happens when it isn't built in. So Verisign is they've got a sweet deal. They're built in. That's why you never see these things pop up when you first boot up Netscape. If it wasn't, then when you first booted it up, it would take you through that whole process.
So suppose if somebody was lucky and cracked Verisign's public key, then they would know the private key of like 1,000 people?
Well, they would, if they cracked it, then they could fake being a certificate authority. If they cracked the key, you're saying if they got if they got the secret key, right? If they got Verisign's secret key, what would happen is that there would be a lot of, they could spoof being a Verisign, because they could start issuing certificates. Because when one of these dates, when one of these things expires, right, when you have these certificates here which are issued to you from Verisign, right, when they expire, you have to go back to Verisign and get another one.
Yeah, but they'll get the key from the client. Suppose they have like,
They still don't have any private keys of anybody.
Yeah, they don't have, Verisign doesn't have anyone's.
When you send these messages, right, I can interrupt those messages probably fairly easily. So I can have a big database.
Mm-hmm.
And then if one day somebody find out what is the private key of Verisign, I can get the private key of all those companies. These are actually, this means public, and they're secret. Yeah, this one here is the client's public key also. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so you don't send ever your private key.
Yeah, you you give your secret key to anybody. Just you give your public key out. Okay. So what you can do here is, make sure I'm copying all this. Always want to give some kind of unique ID, and you seal this with the. This is sealed with the secret key of the issuer. That's what this signature is. So let's remember, this is the thing. If you want to verify that the certificate is valid, you create a message like this. This thing here, as we discussed, you either have to get it if you don't know it through the certificate popping up, or if it's built in, then you implicitly trust it. You send that to the issuer. And what the issuer does is it decrypts this message and says, okay, it looks like somebody's giving me a signature, which is something that I know about. They're giving me a nonce, and they're giving me their public key. And what I'm going to return back to this client, which is your Netscape browser, is I'm going to take this signature and I'm going to decrypt it for them. And I'm going to turn it into the issuee's name, the valid dates, and I'm also going to throw the nonce in there that you sent me, and I'm going to encrypt that with. I'm going to send that over to back to the clients, and I'm going to encrypt that with the client's public key. So this is what the signature. The signature contains some of this stuff. You can use the signature then you decrypt the signature. Actually, this is wrong. Sorry. What the server does, what the Verisign server will do is it'll take this signature, it'll suck this information out of it, it'll decrypt it, and then it'll throw that into a message. Like this. Throw that into a message along with the nonce, and then use the client's public key to send that back to you. So this is what the signature looks like. The signature is this, which was originally encrypted by Verisign or the issuer with their secret key. Let's see. Sorry, with their public key. Why is it their public, not their secret? No, because you don't want anyone else to be able to decrypt it, right? So that's how you protect it. And so when you get this back, you say, oh, okay, so now I was able to, I got this signature, I sent it off to somebody who I trust because I had their public, sealed with their public key. I got back something that matches what's in the certificate. I got back my nonce to make sure there's no kinds of replays or make sure this is a one-time thing. And so now I know that this certificate is valid. So now what I can do is I can take this key and start communicating.
Is there a good overview of this somewhere?
Yeah. There's in the readings, actually, in the textbook, they they give a lot of examples of this kind of thing. The main thing that you have to understand, this becomes a little bit more intuitive when if you have this sort of private, the private and, the public and secret key, and you remember that the reason you seal something in a public key that you send out is that because you want to make sure that when someone's going to be able to send it back to you, to verify that you were the one who actually sealed it to begin with. When you seal something with your secret key and send it out, it's because you want someone else to know that it was you who actually sent it. So that's, if you remember those two things that I put up before, if you keep those two things in mind and what they're for, whenever you see something like message sealed with public, then look at the other side of that arrow and see, well, it's because someone else wants to do X with it. That's why you do it. So that's if you think about it that way, these things start making a little bit more intuitive sense. Now, there's always, there's holes you can poke in this. Like one of them was, can you really trust this public key or not? Well, I could give you a fake, some kind of rogue version of Netscape that has something that in there that is that has my own key in there, and that's one way I could get around that. I could break into your computer and change that where that's stored, and that's another way I can get around that. So there's still at some level there's still more protection to be done, but at that point the cost of doing it starts becoming prohibitive compared to the information you're trying to protect.
Could you repeat the purpose that you would seal something with the public key? I thought.
Well, in this case, the signature that's in this certificate, you seal it with your own public key, because the signature is something that you don't want someone else to alter. So if you don't want someone else to alter, the only way they can alter it is if they can decrypt it and see what's inside that message. And so if you sealed it with your secret key, then anyone with your public key can decrypt it. So you seal it with your public key, so that they
just repackage that whole thing when they
send it to you.
And you can decode it.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So you never send anything out encrypted with your secret key unless you unless you want the world to be able to read it and know it comes from you. Okay. Now, when was it? About 6 months ago, 8 months ago, Clinton signed into effect a piece of legislation that allowed you to use digital signatures, and they can rely on public key type systems like this. But now it's allowable for you to sign certain types of documents using some kind of digital signature, which can use these types of ideas, right? You can take a hash, for example, of a document, and use that as part of a digital signature.
One more thing.
Mm-hmm.
The nonce in the original message sent out, that message is not going to be decoded until it gets back to the original signature. So how does this nonce in the second?
What you do, this nonce here is the same as this one, and you send that nonce, which can be like a timestamp, to prevent replay of messages. So,
since that packet that's inside the curly braces in the first one never gets opened until it gets back to the original sender, right?
No, you actually send this to the issuer.
That whole packet.
Yeah,
the public key. So the whole packet is going to be
Just the signature is coded that way.
Yeah, just the signature piece is coded this way.
So really, the curly braces should only be around the signature.
No, then it's a different.
Yeah, what you're doing is your Netscape client. Your Netscape client, because your Netscape client received this certificate here, and it says, okay, what do I have? What does this certificate tell me? Well, it gives me the signature here, and it tells me this is, let's say it's Verisign's signature. So guess what? I know Verisign's public key, so I'm going to try to make sure that this certificate here actually is something that Verisign sent to Amazon. So how do I make sure that it was actually Verisign that sent this to Amazon and it wasn't someone else who sent it to Amazon? Well, the way that I do that is I say, well, I have a signature here, which is Verisign's, some bit string that I can't decrypt. And then I have the name of Verisign. Inside my Netscape client, it can turn that name directly into the Verisign's public key. So now what I do as the Netscape is I put this message together, which is the signature, which to me is a black box, some nonce, and then I include my public key in there, and I seal that all up with Verisign's key and send it off. So what I'm doing when I send it off to Verisign is I'm saying, okay, I'm assuming Verisign is the only person that's going to be able to break this message up into these three pieces. The second thing that once Verisign, so once we get to the issuer, this signature is something that the issuer says, oh, this is something that I previously encrypted. And so I'm going to try to decrypt it now. So when I decrypt it as Verisign, then I say, oh, well, okay, it has the name of the issuee, which is Amazon. It has the dates that I originally stuffed in that certificate. It has the Amazon's key that they wanted to use to communicate, their public key. And I'm going to send those things back to the Netscape client, along with the nonce, to prove that I was able to decrypt their request. And I'm going to seal that all up with your Netscape client's public key. So now when I'm the Netscape client, I get this back. And how do I verify this? Well, I say, the only way I could have gotten this back is if Verisign had decrypted this signature. I didn't tell Verisign that I was trying to communicate with Amazon, yet they came back with Amazon's name. They came back with the same valid dates that it was over here. They also came back with the key. Right, so that you can even say, well, if you're sending this key back, you can even say, well, I'm just going to use that one and not even use this one over here. If you're not sending the key back, so it's not strictly required, you can just take that off or use that one. So now that I'm Netscape, now what I don't know is that this certificate is valid. In that case,
how did Verisign know that it was Amazon.com that it was supposed to send it back for?
Because the signature here that I'm giving it was which
Amazon.
Yeah. Okay. So Amazon originally got this thing here from Verisign, and Amazon sends this out to whatever browser wants to authenticate. Okay. If you have questions about this, let's go over it after lecture. And we can go over it as much as you want, because getting a feel for this type of thing is one of the important pieces of deciding how to build these types of systems. So the last thing, SSL. So this is the certificate piece is what SSL is built on top of. So what SSL does is it says, let's first exchange certificates. The certificate between a client, so the server, you're trying to communicate to Amazon. So the client goes to Amazon and says, give me your certificate. So Amazon comes back with the certificate. And then the client will verify it using this process, and then we'll say, oh, great. Now there's a step here, which is a step where a client could actually send a certificate it generates over to Amazon. It isn't necessarily required, but it's something that you can do with the protocol. Now, if this second piece here is done, it's usually you want to do this kind of thing. Like if you're two business entities or two where the transaction is going to matter even more, what you want to do is make sure you cross-authenticate. Like Amazon doesn't care if you're faking your identity as being someone else's. What they care about is credit card fraud, right? And they don't care if you're typing in your spouse's password. I mean, that's to them, as long as they're getting the money and as long as it's not fraudulent, they don't care. But if you're suppose you're doing a business-to-business transaction, right? You don't necessarily want to be paying someone who you're not really doing business with. In that case, you'd want the exchange to take place, and then the other side would go through this authentication mechanism to verify the identity of the client in this case. So once you've done that, the next step you do is you exchange messages to establish what cipher you're going to use. Now, SSL is flexible in that it allows you to use different types of ciphers. So they knew that it's possible that ciphers can be broken, and they didn't want this protocol to be limited, its lifetime to be limited by the cryptographic strength of today's ciphers. And one of the things that you do in that step is you exchange some what are called pre-master keys. And these pre-master keys can be random numbers that are generated on each side, and together they use to establish a session key. And the session key will depend on whatever cipher you're using. If you're using the IDEA cipher from RSA, or if you're using Blowfish or whatever it might be, you'll use this set of random numbers to generate a different session key. Now, once you've established a session key is something that's valid only for that session, for that SSL session. And once you're done communicating back and forth, then you just drop it on the floor and get rid of it. That means that if someone is able to figure out that session key, a year later, it's not going to matter. You'll have gone through many session keys by then and won't be using it. So that's the essence of how SSL works. Any questions on that?
But you can, if you store the communication and you break it, then a year later you can find out what the communication was about.
Yeah, you can find out what happened if you store it. Yeah, you can find out. So then you get back to this whole time value of data, which is that a year later, is it worth it? Is that information worth anything, and how much did it cost you to break that? Because maybe the cost of you breaking that is more than what you get out of it. Right? If it was a credit card that had a $100 credit limit, and it costs you, you bought a $500 computer to break it a year later, then you're not going to be making a lot of money. That's right. Okay, I believe that is it. Okie doke.